Hi, my name's Joanne Caffrey, and what we're going to look at here is the issue of suicide in custody. So we need to understand what suicide is and also what do we mean by custody. So when we look at what the definition of suicide is, it's to establish suicide, the deceased did an act which caused their own death with the intention that the act would have that fatal consequence. Suicide should never be presumed and were other possible explanations ruled out. If there is a death in custody, then issues for the organisation is around the positive obligation and the right to life under Article 2 of the Human Rights Act. Now, when we look at the statistics in relation to suicide, the general population, the Office for National Statistics in 2017 said there was an average of 10 suicides per 100,000 population. However, in custody, according to the Ministry of Defence in 2016, that statistic is 120 per 100,000 population. Now, if we look at two different parts of England, we've got London with a statistic for their population of 7.7 per 100,000 suicides, where Cumbria, which has the Lake District, that's virtually double that of London, with a suicide rate of 15 per 100,000. Now, when we look at custody and the UK custody response, we're talking about England, Wales, Scotland and Ireland. And we're also then within those sections looking at the prisons and young offender institutions. We're looking at police custody, secure transport services, court custody, immigration, the child secure accommodation, mental health, customs custody and military detention. So it's not just a narrow area when we talk about custody. Then all those different areas of the UK then look at the governance of custody, and they're all aiming to comply with the European standards. Now, significant European standards to consider are the CPT standards of 2015, and that stands for the European Committee for the Prevention of Torture and Inhumane or Degrading Treatment or Punishment of 2015. Then we have the UK standards. Now, this is known as the United Nations Optional Protocol to the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhumane and Degrading Treatment or Punishment, otherwise known as OPCAT. And within this then sits the UK's National Preventive Mechanism, which is known as the NPM. Now, a subcommittee of the NPM is the SPT, which stands for the Subcommittee on Prevention of Torture. Now, looking then at who makes up the NPM, there's 21 members of the NPM, and we have them all listed here, and this is covering all parts of the UK. So we've got England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland. We've got the prison sector, the police sector, the care sector, the education sector, and the human rights commissions. So there's 21 organisations across the board who then make part of this assessment team. Now, the assessment team then, what we need to understand is about the law in relation to what they're assessing, but ultimately it all funnels back to the European rights and entitlements, because when we're looking at the hierarchy of law, as we've got here in yellow, human rights and entitlements is the key legislation that we're looking at in relation to custody. Underneath this, we've then got Acts of Parliament, so there might be slight variations between the different countries in relation to their particular Acts of Parliament and regulations. We also then need to consider the statutory and non-statutory guidance in relation to each sector in each country, and then the policy and procedures that go with that, and then also the different advice in relation to training packages and audits. However, what we'll see in relation to the custody sector is that although there might be different countries and different Acts of Parliament, ultimately they all say similar things. Now, when we look at the two key human rights and entitlements in relation to custody, the ones that we're going to be looking at a lot more in our training is about the right to life, Article 2. Now, that's an absolute right, which also includes a positive obligation on the state to protect life. And Article 5, the right to liberty and security. And this is a limited right, So we'll learn what the difference is as well between positive obligations and absolute right and limited rights. Now then, when we're looking at issues of Acts of Parliament, we'll highlight the issues around the various different Health and Safety at Work Acts, the Mental Health Acts, the different Care Acts, offences against persons, manslaughter, etc. And then looking at the different organisations and what they call their assessment process. So for example, the prison sector in Scotland, they call it the standards. The prison sector in England and Wales call it the expectations. The Care Quality Commission call it the fundamental standards. And the police sector in England and Wales, it's called the expectations. But ultimately, when we look at each different standard, expectation or fundamental standard, they're all very similar because they're all looking to comply back with those European standards. So then for each different sector, so whether it's prison, police, mental health, there's also then data which looks at suicide and also about managing ligature risks. Now, in all the sectors, the most commonly used method of suicide is that of ligature death. And we'll look at the different kinds of hanging and also how people can attach different things to ligature points. Now, in the prison sector, the key areas for the ligature death is either in the cell or the healthcare, where in the police sector, we're looking at the cell is the most commonly used. We also look at what they're going to predominantly use for that hanging event, and it's often bedding or clothing. Now, clothing wise, we're talking about belts and shoelaces. The ligature then is attached commonly to either windows, beds or door frames. And we'll look there about how you can attach it to the door handles, the designs of those. Even if the door frames are coming loose from the wall, that you can get a lace in behind that. The most common person to die by suicide within custody is male. However, asphyxiation death is still the most common method for male and females, but there's more men than women actually die by asphyxiation through hanging. Also, what's been found in the prison sector is those men who do hang are commonly imprisoned for violence or sex offences. Also in the prison sector, the daytime hours are actually key times. So by daytime hours, we're talking about 6 AM to 6 PM. We'll also look at ligature points and the fact it only takes 2 millimeters, so either a crack of 2 millimeters or something protruding for 2 millimeters in order to attach a ligature. Now, when we look at the custody issue as well, custody starts from the point of police contact. So even prior to the arrest is governed by custody. And ultimately, safer custody, the terminology safer custody is about bringing all of the pieces of the jigsaw together to prevent death and injury in the secure sector. So the 4 hours of e-learning suicide prevention awareness for the custody sector will take into consideration many different aspects, but also each custody sector can learn from the other, and we'll look at common principles between all of those sectors. So thank you very much for your time, and if you've got any questions, please don't hesitate to make contact.